Good afternoon, my lady.
Good afternoon.
May I please call Helena Herklotz?
Thank you very much.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
I'd like to take a seat.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Herklotz, for coming back to give evidence at the COVID inquiry. You were the former Older People's Commissioner for Wales, appointed on the 20th of August 2018, and your term of office ended on the 19th of August 2024. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The role of the Older People's Commissioner for Wales is an independent statutory role with the remit to protect and promote the rights of older people in Wales. Is that right? And you undertook a lot of work during the pandemic in order to promote the rights of older people within care homes and also within their own homes. However, I'm going to mainly focus on the liaison that you had with the Welsh Government. You had weekly meetings with the Deputy Minister for Health and Social Services, Julie Morgan, and also the Deputy Director for Health and Social Services during the pandemic. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in Module 2B, you spoke about a letter that you wrote to Julie Morgan dated the 14th of April, following a meeting with her on the 9th of April, in which you set out concerns about the impact of the pandemic on older people in care homes. You'd mentioned a number of matters that you wanted addressed in that, but that also included there being a care home actions plan. You received a response from Julie Morgan on the 21st of April, and in your statement, you've stated that you are not happy with the response that you'd received. In particular, she declined your suggestion of a care homes action plan, stating that she was not convinced that an additional plan would add value. In your view, what do you think the Care Homes Action Plan could have brought about to the benefit of older people if she'd agreed with your suggestion in April?
So at that time in April, people were in a really desperate situation in care homes. People were being discharged from hospital without testing. We were seeing increasing numbers of people losing their lives in care homes. And I felt there needed to be coordinated action led by Welsh Government and led by the Deputy Minister to bring together the different strands of action that were needed. So that included things like access to PPE, testing, looking at issues around visiting. I also felt that older people living in care homes, their family and friends and the care sector needed to know that the Welsh Government was being focused on doing all it could to protect older people in care homes and to offer that reassurance by a public plan. That would have, in my view, as a plan, some timescales and some way in which, therefore, the public and myself as Older People's Commissioner could constructively scrutinise the action. And in my discussions with Julie Morgan, the Deputy Minister, I felt that she was sympathetic to the issues that I was raising. And then I was extremely disappointed to get a letter to say, no, it won't add value. There was reference to a number of different groups that were set up, and there was going to be another work stream. But it didn't, in my view, show the urgency that was needed. And it didn't address the issue of people needing to hear from Welsh Government that it understood what was happening and it was going to do all it could to protect older people living in care homes and people working in care homes.
In the letter, Julie Morgan also invited you to join the social care subgroup. Just to clarify, was that the Welsh Government Social Care Planning and Response subgroup?
Yes, I think it was called that, and there was going to be a work stream as part of that they said would look at care homes.
And was this the first time you were invited to join a working group specifically for the adult social care sector during the pandemic?
I'm trying to recollect now because there are a lot of different working groups, and there was a lot of engagement actually with Welsh Government at that time. So it might have been the first time in terms of a formal group, but I can't quite recollect that.
That's fine. I can see from your statement that you had been invited to the COVID-19 Moral and Ethical Advisory Group on the 3rd of April 2020, but I presume that wouldn't have just been in relation to the adult social care sector, would it?
So the COVID-19 Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, part of the reason I think I was invited to that and part of the reason it was set up was because of the issue of do not attempt CPR notices. So that obviously covered a lot of issues across health and care in terms of ethical decision making.
Thank you. I'm going to briefly ask you some questions in respect of the work that you undertook with the Equality and Human Rights Commission. You and the head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission for Wales on the 20th of July 2020 wrote to the Minister for Health and Social Services expressing concerns about the rights of older people in care homes and requesting information. If I could just pull up on screen INQ 000 106, page 18, paragraph 93. This is the specific information that you requested from the Welsh Government: equality impact assessments and scientific evidence for all decision-making linked to care homes, evidence of how due regard was given to the three needs of the public sector equality duty in the decision-making process around protecting care homes by the Welsh Government, and details of the arrangements in place to review and revise policies to ensure that they comply with the public sector equality duty and specific duties. There were a number of meetings and letters after that at which it was clarified that the Welsh Government's response would focus on care homes, specifically decisions on testing, including decisions made to discharge people into care homes from hospital without testing, the provision of PPE, and visits to care homes. You'd also, and the head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Wales, stated you wanted evidence on how the rights of older people living in care homes were considered from the beginning of the delay phase, from the 13th of March 2020 until the 18th of June 2020. You received a response from the Deputy Director General for Health and Social Services on the 2nd of November. And in it, he was responding to what you had requested. However, on the 27th of November 2020, you and the head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission wrote back in response, stating that the evidence provided was not sufficient to address the concerns highlighted. What was it about the evidence that made it insufficient, in your view?
One of the key things we asked for was evidence of the undertaking of equality impact assessments. This was crucial because we wanted to see if and how the Welsh Government had examined the possible impacts of its policy and decision-making on older people and on older people's rights, and to also ensure, from the Equality and Human Rights Commission perspective, that they were following their obligations under the Equality Act. The information that was sent to us did not give us the assurance that that had been done. It did set out ways in which decisions had been made to some extent and some evidence. But in relation to the key element, which was about equality impact assessments, instead of really saying this is what we had undertaken, it wasn't able to demonstrate it had undertaken equality impact assessments. Instead, it really set out a rationale for why they say they hadn't done it. And this included something that I found very worrying at the time, and still do, which is that they set out that they didn't need to do that at all times because they intuitively knew the action that was needed. Now, we all have blind spots and unconscious bias, and unless you have mechanisms in place to make sure that people's assumptions or stereotypes that they might hold aren't present in decision making and policy making, there is a risk that they are. So we felt we'd asked the questions, they hadn't been answered sufficiently or comprehensively, so that's why we went back asking for further meetings and further work to be done.
And for completeness, what was the outcome of this investigation?
So the work took us through to December time, that initial phase of work, and we had a more productive meeting, I would say, towards the end of December with the Minister for Health and Social Services, Deputy Minister and other officials, where Welsh Government at that point then said they could see there had been some gaps in what they were doing. They hadn't necessarily recorded equality impact assessments. The Equality and Human Rights Commission was following up in terms of training. There was going to be work done internally within Welsh Government to look at its processes. And we felt at that point that they'd really started to address the issues that we had raised, specifically in relation to their decision-making and use of equality impact assessments.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to discuss the discharge of people from hospitals, both into care homes and also into their own homes. You've stated that the discharge of older people from hospitals to care homes without testing for COVID was a key concern of yours in the early weeks and months of the pandemic. Were you consulted on the decision to discharge without testing?
Not to my recollection.
On the 11th of December 2020, you were consulted regarding the proposed low positive cases and also the admission into care homes and the duration of outbreaks. If I could just bring up INQ 000185024, and if we look at the part that's that's italicized, that sort of explains what the revised discharge data criteria would have been. In essence, before that, it was negative tests in order for them to be discharged into hospitals. But the Welsh Government was considering that they could allow either the test being negative or there being a low positive with the CT value of 35. In your statement, you'd stated that you had some concerns about the testing criteria only being applied to older people living in care homes, or those who would move down to a step-down facility, that the admission of low positive cases involved increased risk in comparison to the current policy, which would have been negative test, and there was uncertainty about how the change would work in practice. You'd mentioned those concerns to the Welsh Government, and you received a response on the 14th of December from the Welsh Government, but you still had concerns. And if I could pull up INQ 000185049, page 1, please. Thank you. If we just look at paragraph 2 of your email that was sent on the 16th of December 2020, well, the first paragraph, you give thanks for the response to the questions you had raised, but the second paragraph you state, I note the tag paper's high confidence that individuals can be judged to be non-infectious if there has been symptomatic improvement, if 20 days have elapsed from symptom onset, or RT-PCR testing for SARS-CoV-2 is negative or has a high CT value. However, it also states that there remains uncertainty around the period of infectivity for individuals with SARS-CoV-2. During Monday's press conference, the Minister for Health and Social Services stated that in these circumstances, individuals will be very unlikely to be infectious in the vast majority of cases. This indicates that some risk would remain that individuals could still be infectious in this situation and could pose a risk of infection spreading into care home or other setting. You then mentioned that at the meeting last week, it was confirmed that the Welsh Government was the only administration in the UK making this change. You asked if that remains the case, and you asked if they was able to provide any evidence from other countries that had implemented a policy of discharging people from hospital whilst they were still returning a low positive result. Did you receive a response to this?
No.
What, if anything, did you do to try and obtain a response?
So this was just in the run-up to Christmas, and the nature of this meeting, it was one of my regular meetings with the Deputy Minister for Social Services, so I didn't know that this discussion was going to take place. It felt to me that I was being asked for my views at a very late stage, and I felt that the decision had really already been made. And I did what I could to raise questions, and also questions about how would it be implemented and monitored. And at that stage, it felt that that was all I could do, because it felt like the decision was being made.
I'm going to ask some questions about visiting restrictions, which I understand was a key concern of yours during the pandemic. Now, I understand there was a care home visiting stakeholder group, which was set up by Care Inspector at Wells, and you first attended the group in June 2020. Is this around the time that the group was first set up?
Yes.
What benefits did the group bring?
I was really pleased that the group was set up, because there were a lot of different organisations and agencies involved in making decisions and having perspectives about visiting. And it felt like quite a muddled situation about where did accountability lie, who is responsible for making decisions. So bringing everybody into the same group to work through felt like the only possible way forward, really. And it meant that everybody could hear the different perspectives that were being brought to it. I attended the first few meetings, and then members of my team attended on my behalf, and we were able to raise issues about the rights of older people, about the impact of people being isolated from family and friends, about the need to work harder to enable safe visiting. So it felt like the best mechanism at that point, really, to try and make progress in terms of producing guidance that would then be implementable as well, so it could be operationalised.
Do you think it succeeded in that aim?
I think it definitely made progress. It definitely led to guidance being produced, and it kept the spotlight on visiting. I think the nature of it meant there were a number of different iterations as time went on, and I think that was difficult for people working in care homes. There was also an issue at all times, really, between guidance at the national level and then what would happen at the local level. And again, issues about where did accountability lie, therefore, for making decisions about visiting. So I felt it was the best possible mechanism at the time, and it definitely had a positive impact in terms of easing visiting restrictions. And also because I think Welsh Government were very plugged into it as well, it meant that, you know, the ultimate decision makers on things were part of it.
Do you think in a future pandemic, such a group should exist from the start?
I think in a future pandemic, there needs to be, at the outset, greater clarity about who is responsible for making those decisions and clear accountability for that. I found it incredibly frustrating in the early stages, having conversations where, you know, somebody might be sympathetic but saying it's not my area of responsibility or accountability to make that decision. So there needs to be much greater clarity about particularly where the role of Public Health Wales is and where the role of local teams are as well. And that should have a much greater focus on the rights of older people and the importance of weighing up the risk of COVID infection against and giving due weight to the risk of people being isolated from their families and isolated from their loved ones.
And you had mentioned in Module 2B that issue with not knowing who the decision maker was in respect of care home visiting. How did this issue affect care home visiting in practice?
It took longer to work through who could make the decisions to get visiting happening. And it meant that there was a lack of clarity about that. It took some time for me to find the right people, actually, and then to liaise with the key person in Public Health Wales who had the responsibility for that. And then it took some time to get across the importance of visiting, because they hadn't really, I don't think they'd factored that into their decision making. And I think it made things took longer. Sometimes one was starting from a perspective of having to sort of almost educate people about what care homes are and how people live in care homes, and they're not medical institutions. So all of that took time and people's energy, and I think, you know, it was a frustration at the time. That said, once we'd got through that phase, people worked hard together to try and make those, you know, make the right things happen. And then it was more of an issue, I think, of particular local areas taking different views. So I remember, for example, around outdoor visiting, where in 2 local authorities they'd kind of moved back from that, and I wasn't clear at all the rationale for that. So I then had to go to Public Health Wales to kind of raise that issue directly with them again.
And just speaking on that, I have seen a letter from you to the Welsh Government dated the 21st of September 2020, and if I could pull that up on screen, it's INQ 951, page 1. So this is a letter that you sent to Public Health Wales, and it was in respect of the suspension of outdoor visits, which is what you mentioned before. And as you said, you weren't happy with that, and you asked a number of questions, which you can see in the bullet points. The first one being, what evidence is there of transmission from outdoor visits by family and friends? What level of risk is there from outdoor visits, assuming these are carried out more than 2 meters apart and with visitors wearing masks? In taking decisions to suspend outdoor visiting, was the impact of not receiving visits on older people's health and well-being also considered? And how is the decision on suspension of visits being kept under review? And what evidence is used to inform that review? Presumably you were asking those questions because essentially there was just blanket suspensions without there being, in your mind, any sort of evidence as to why that was necessary.
I was asking the questions because I didn't see any evidence, and it seemed a completely disproportionate response at a time when, you know, just getting to outdoor visiting had taken, you know, a huge amount of steps to get there, and the idea that that could then be suspended so quickly just felt entirely wrong. And it comes back to, you know, in a sense, to a bit of a recurring theme, really, which was, how are these decisions being made? What is the evidence? How are they going to be monitored? How are they going to be communicated? So that was the questions I was raising at this time as well, and then discussed in my meetings.
Did you get an answer to this question?
So I didn't get a formal letter in response. We discussed these questions during my meeting. I can't recollect the detail of that at the time now, but my sense of it was that I didn't get answers to all of that. Partly my role was about encouraging those sorts of agencies to ask these sorts of questions and to take that sort of action.
And I just wanted to point to you a position from Care Inspector at Wales when it comes to visiting. If we could bring up their statement, it's INQ 0005697773, page 86, paragraph 258. In it, Care Inspector at Wells say that they were aware of the profound impact on the well-being that could result from restrictions on visitors. I was keen to ensure proportionate and balanced decisions were made in relation to restricting visits, in particular outdoor visits. Our position at this time was what happened in care homes should mirror what was happening and permissible in local communities. In particular, our view was, while the public could meet outside, people in care homes should also have that right. And we share that with the Welsh Government. Do you agree with that view?
I certainly agree that the very minimum should be that people in care homes should have the same rights as people elsewhere. In addition, I would add that if you are living in a care home, there are reasons for that. It might be because of your care and support needs. It might be because you have other vulnerabilities. So actually, there should be additional work to see if actually people living in care homes can actually have more contact and support than perhaps those of us who were able to, didn't need to have that kind of level of care and support. So I would have said that was the very minimum that we should be working towards.
Thank you. And I just wanted to go back because I forgot to ask you a question about the difficulty in not knowing who the decision maker was. Is there a particular organisation that you think should hold the responsibility when it comes to visiting restrictions within the Welsh Government?
I think ultimately it needs to be a clear decision by Welsh Government because it is the body that can coordinate what is happening. It felt to me that they were waiting on advice from Public Health Wales, and therefore it felt like maybe almost by default it was a sort of Public Health Wales decision. So I think in any pandemic in the future, I think governments need to own those decisions, and they need to be clear about where they're taking advice and then the decisions that they're making as a government on that basis.
I want to turn to your concerns about the increase in abuse towards older people during the pandemic. And if I could pull up a document, it's INQ 000584937, page 2, please. These are minutes of a meeting of the cross-party group on older people and ageing, which was held on the 23rd of June 2020. And if we look at the paragraph with the heading abuse of older people, it states that you said, the Commissioner told the group that many older people no longer getting visits from relatives and health professionals, that there was an increased opportunities for abuse. The Commissioner also warned that with people caring for one another, there can be increased pressures on the carer, which can also lead to abuse. And you said that the issue of abuse doesn't get the profile it deserves and that more needs to be done to safeguard older people. So you've mentioned in that paragraph the risk coming from the lack of visits from loved ones and healthcare professionals. I was wondering what your views were on the suspension of routine inspections by Care Inspector at Wells and whether or not that might have added to this risk of abuse.
Yeah, so the prevention of abuse and the recognition of abuse of older people is one of the major area of work I undertook during the pandemic. And actually, my main focus was about people living in their own homes where I felt the risks were particularly high. In relation to people in care homes, what is very valuable when you are living in a care home, and indeed working in a care home, is to have people coming in and out, to have relatives there, to have family and friends, to have professionals visiting. Sometimes that's just because small things can be raised before they become big things. If an older person maybe who's living in a care home is a bit worried about making a complaint or something, if they have a family member there, they can help them to do that. And if you have professionals and family and friends coming in, there's a lot of eyes on that care. And so my concern was that that was being removed. So it was about partly Care Inspector at Wales not visiting and doing inspections, but it was a much broader issue. That was one part of it, but it was about the entirety of, no visits from GPs in most cases, for example, relatives and families not being able to go in, and therefore that there could be an increased risk in terms of abuse of older people, and not necessarily talking about extreme cases, but those issues where people feel they are not being listened to, or maybe there are elements of their care which is not as it should be.
And do you think that the profile of this issue, this risk of abuse, was risen during the pandemic, or do you think it was still not really taken or seen as important?
I work with a number of organisations. I set up an action group on the prevention of abuse of older people, and one of the things I called for actually was an action plan, which I'm pleased to say was subsequently worked on and published by the Welsh Government. So the issue of the risks of older people experiencing abuse wherever they live, and huge different types of abuse, from domestic violence to neglect, for example, I think that the awareness of that has increased. There is still good work going underway. There is a long way to go yet for it to be recognised and for it to be prevented and for people to get the support that they need. But I do feel that's an area that improvements have been made, and I think some of those improvements certainly are sustainable and will sustain.
I'm going to ask you some questions about DNACPRs and blanket use. You've referred to a letter sent by a GP surgery to some of their patients. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that because some of the CPs will, and you also answered some questions in Module 2B. However, I understand you were made aware of other practices where GPs were contacting older people or their family members over the phone to get them to agree to DNA CPRs, and the fact that that was causing a lot of distress for the person concerned and also their family members, especially considering the fact that sometimes they were separated from them. I've seen at least 2 of those instances in your witness statement. How common was this? How common was it?
When the issue came to the fore from that initial letter and became public, we then got contacted by a member of the Senedd, some family members and others. And throughout the pandemic, at different times, these issues were raised. So sometimes it might be I was having meetings with older people and they raised it informally. So I was aware that it was certainly much more than a few isolated incidents.
How do you think we can prevent this from happening again?
Well, there needs to be a number of actions taken forward, and I'm pleased to say that some of this has been happening in Wales, where there's been work to review the NHS guidance on this, in particular in relation to communications. So there needs to be much better and clearer communications about what DNA CPR is, and particularly the area that needs to be strengthened is to make sure there have been proper discussions with the individual and or their family or advocate as appropriate. And also that there shouldn't be, and there mustn't be, any link between a decision on DNA CPR, which is specific to do not attempt CPR, and access to other treatment. And one of the most chilling things, I think, about what we were seeing during the pandemic was where DNA CPR was also linked to saying, and you won't get other treatment, you won't get an ambulance, for example. And that was frightening and really frightening for older people. And that cast a very, very long shadow throughout the pandemic and possibly beyond, where older people, rather than trusting the NHS, some feared going to it because they feared that their lives might not be protected in the way that they should be. And that, I remember the conversations that older people had with me about that.
So do you think, for example, the example that you mentioned in your witness statement about the 97-year-old mother being contacted on the phone, and she was living alone, for example, and was asked to agree to a DNA CPR. Do you think that sort of scenario with GPs just calling older individual people on their own in a pandemic is the right way to do it, or do you think it should be done with differently?
It's not the right way to do it at all. It's a very frightening call to get out of the blue, isn't it? What we need to see more broadly is an approach to advanced care planning where these things are as far as possible, done in advance, that you can have a conversation out with a crisis where you can make your wishes known. That's obviously the ideal approach. When it is much more of an emergency, I think those sorts of calls just are, and it was expressed to me how terrifying those calls could be. So it is an area where I believe there are actions that can be taken to improve processes into the future, and those need to be taken.
I want to bring up some concerns that were raised by the COVID-bereaved Families for Justice Cymru in their witness statement. And if I could pull that up, it's INQ 000474759, page 26. Paragraph 77. Thank you. They state that they met with you to lobby for change concerning DNACPRs, care homes and complaints procedures on various dates from October 2021 onwards. They state that they were pleased to see the steps taken by you in voicing these issues. However, it was their view that these steps should have been the norm in the first place. The fact that they needed addressing shows a shocking lack of care and respect for older people's problems in Wales in the first place. And if you can look at paragraph 78, they state it's their view that the meetings felt unproductive. The group acknowledges that you appeared to actively engage with the discussion and show genuine sympathy to what was conveyed throughout these meetings. However, this discussion felt wholly unproductive. It's their position that the Welsh Government and the First Minister failed to heed any recommendation made to you by them. What do you have to say in response to that?
Well, I'm surprised by that. It wasn't something that was reflected to me at the time at all. We had a number of meetings which I felt were very useful. I can understand their frustration that their recommendations weren't necessarily being taken forward by Welsh Government, however.
And I'm just going to come to your lessons learned and recommendations, which you've helpfully set out in your witness statement. Your assessment was essentially that older people were not adequately considered by the Welsh Government when making decisions during the pandemic. That's for your reference, it's from page 48, paragraph 226 onwards. And you list a number of decisions to illustrate your point, namely the Coronavirus Act, removing people's legal right to have their eligible needs for care and support met. Presumably you're referring to what we colloquially call easements.
Yes.
The discharge of older people from hospitals without testing for COVID-19, and visiting restrictions and restrictions on residents being able to go out of the care home, which you say caused great distress and harm. You've made a number of recommendations, but I'm only going to focus on three. The first one being improvements in the support that the NHS provides to the social care sector, particularly to care homes, and monitoring residents' access to medical treatment to ensure they are not being disadvantaged. As far as you're aware, has any work been undertaken on this point in preparation for a future pandemic?
I'd caveat my response to say I'm the former commissioner and haven't been in post since middle of last August. There has been some work undertaken, particularly in relation to GPs, and in fact some of the work that I was doing around access to primary care is still going on in terms of improving the way in which GPs can support older people more generally. I'm not aware of the detail of what's happening now, though.
And you mentioned also changes to the government structures and processes to ensure that there is social care experience and expertise in policy and decision-making at an appropriate level. And you recommend this because you say there was a lack of knowledge and understanding of the care sector amongst policy and decision-makers in the Welsh Government. Do you think that this has been rectified in your view, obviously before you left your position?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to this. One is the ministerial element and one is the official levels. And in the Welsh Government and indeed other governments, the social care minister is often or almost always junior to the health minister. And I think that's the first part of the problem, which should be addressed at that level. You should have, in my view, a care minister that at cabinet level, so that at cabinet level there is that feed in terms of the social care sector, which is a hugely important sector in terms of the people it supports, but also in terms of the economy and wider society. So first of all, I think there needs to be ministerial weight, if you like, given to social care. And then in relation to the structures within government, the importance of having a role similar to a chief social care officer, I think importantly that that person has a clear specialist advisory role to government, across government, and expertise in terms of being a professional social care practitioner. And that is supported by ensuring that those charged with making decisions around social care have enough understanding of social care, including operational realities.
And the final one I wanted to ask you on was your recommendation of improvements in social care data collection, analysis, insight and reporting, both to inform policy and decision making and to understand the consequences of policy and decisions taken. Before you'd left your post, do you think there'd been any improvements in respect of data collection and analysis?
Some slow improvements, gathering data from local authorities and Welsh Government gathering that data and beginning to look at what that data was saying. There is a long way to go, I think, to make sure not just that the data is collected, but importantly that it's made public, that there's opportunities to analyse it and gather the insight from that. And also that it specifically draws out the different groups. Social care helps an enormous number of different groups, from children to disabled people to older people. And it's very important that that data is disaggregated so you can actually see what the issues are for different groups of people. And that's where you can see if there are any persistent inequalities, for example, or particular groups experiencing disadvantage in their access to social care.
Thank you. And is there anything else that you would wish to tell the inquiry?
I think just two final things, if I may. The first one is that I think the pandemic demonstrated the insidious ageism that is embedded in our society, the way in which, as we get older, too often our lives are not valued in the same way, the way in which the stereotypes and assumptions that people make about older age can then feed into policy and decision making. I think there's a need to treat ageism and combating ageism much more seriously, and that needs to be done throughout organisations in terms of training and awareness, and within that, much more serious adherence to the issue of the rights of older people. The second thing I'd like to say is that my work during the pandemic and the extent to which we were able to effect changes was only possible because of the way in which older people worked with me and because of the help and support of my team, in particularly the Deputy Commissioner. So I'd just like to place on record my thanks to them and also my condolences for all of those who lost loved ones and who are still dealing with that grief today.
My lady, those are my questions, but I believe there's some questions from core participants.
There are. Thank you very much, Mr. Tunde. I think it's Mr. Stanton, probably directly across from you, I should think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Good afternoon, Ms. Herclots. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. I have three questions for you, all of which are focused on the responses of Welsh Government and public bodies in Wales to your interventions. The first question relates to the letter that was mentioned earlier by Ms. Shatunde from a GP surgery in Wales in March that you refer to at paragraphs 166 and 167 of your statement. An INQ reference to the letter, just for the inquiry record, is INQ 000 400-633, but there's no need, I think, to bring the letter up. I think you're well aware of it. And it's been mentioned already on a number of occasions in the inquiry hearings. But that letter advised vulnerable and elderly patients that it was unlikely that they would be offered hospital admission, that they certainly wouldn't be offered a ventilated bed, and it requested that they complete a DNACPR form so that family and friends would not call 999. And you've referred already to your concerns in this area. In response to the letter, you issued public statements on the 1st and 6th of April, and they're at INQ 000181737 and INQ 000181738, describing such pressure as shameful and unacceptable, and you called for the protection of people's fundamental human rights. Please could I ask, following these interventions, what changes were made in Wales to the indiscriminate application of DNACPR notices?
The first actions that happened, and one which I'd proposed, was a letter from the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Nursing Officer stating that age alone should not be used in any way to make decisions, and being clear about what the guidance was in relation to DNA CPR. That was followed also by a joint letter, I think, from Care Inspectorate Wales and Health Inspectorate Wales on the same basis. So the first thing that I felt needed to happen was very clear statements from both the health side and the care side that stated that was unacceptable. So that's the first thing that happened. It then was about how can we make improvements into those processes. So I started working on issues about communications on DNA CPR and about information. And one of the issues that came up was just people didn't always understand what DNA CPR meant or what the process should be. So I took work as commissioner to carry out some work on that myself. So we subsequently later produced information about DNA CPR, kind of guidance for people, which we put on our website. We then, and I think this is probably more like 22, 23 time, were involved in work that was being undertaken in Wales to review the DNA CPR guidance. And our role there was about the importance of making sure it attended to older people's rights and to improvements in communication, and also to get a better picture of what was happening, because we didn't know, for example, how many DNA CPR notices were being issued by each health board. So I also raised these issues with Health Inspectorate Wales, and they subsequently undertook a review looking at what was happening in health boards in relation to the issuing of DNA CPR notices. Because if there were particular areas where there seemed to be a disproportionate number being issued, then that would potentially be a cause for concern.
Thank you very much. Moving forward a couple of months, in May 2020, you became so concerned at the failure to protect older people that you took the extraordinary step of referring the Welsh Government for investigation to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. And that's at INQ 000181746. Then on the 21st of June 2020, you produced a report titled A Snapshot of Life in Care Homes in Wales During COVID at INQ 000171725. One of your conclusions at page 22 of that report is that more action was needed to tackle the significant disconnect between what was promised at policy level and what was being delivered on the ground. Can I ask, was this conclusion and recommendation because public bodies in Wales were not acting on the concerns of you and others?
No, I don't think it was that. I think it was more that there needed to be a greater focus on implementation. And this is a more general issue that can happen. Governments issue guidance and sometimes expect it to be implemented immediately. And actually, there needs to be a lot of focus on how can that be implemented. And that means engaging as far as possible, which is more difficult, of course, during a pandemic, but engaging as far as possible with people whose job it will be to implement that guidance, to make sure that it is practical, that it can be taken forward. That's, for example, why the visiting stakeholder group was useful, because it had that ability to do that. So it's a disconnect, really, between a policy and then maybe an assumption that that's being taken forward, when actually you need time, you need support, you need help to make sure that that is implemented.
Thank you. And finally, moving forward again a few months, in October 2020, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission produced their report in response to your referral that found that there may have been a failure in Wales to adequately protect life, and that's at INQ 000 253 853. At this time, numbers of infections in care homes were building, and numbers of deaths were also sadly increasing. And there was very significant further loss of life through November, December, culminating in January 2021. The Cymru Group's position in this regard is that the huge loss of life in the second wave was entirely predictable, and its severity could have been avoided. But that there was a collective failure by public bodies in Wales to look after older people throughout the pandemic, not just at the beginning. And you touched on earlier in your evidence one of those decisions to continue in December, to reverse the decision to only release into a care home with a negative test, to allowing that to happen with a low positive, and your concerns in that regard. Do you agree with the concerns of the Cymru Group that there has been a collective failure throughout the pandemic to protect older people?
I found that there were failures at times to protect older people. And so particularly early in the pandemic, issues around people not being tested, not enough support, healthcare support for older people living in care homes, so a risk to their lives, not just from COVID, but from other illnesses and conditions that they may be having. I also saw extraordinary work by public servants across Wales, and indeed people in the voluntary and community sectors who were doing all they could to protect and support older people. So it was a mixed picture, I would say, in that regard.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Straw, who's probably over the other side of the room, but slightly further down here.
Ms. Herclos, I represent John's campaign, the Patients Association and Care Rights UK. You mentioned earlier a recommendation for the future to have a care minister and a supporting civil servant. In your view, were the views of older people in care and their supporters properly taken into account and also properly implemented by the government during the pandemic?
In terms of the Deputy Minister for Social Services, who's the person that I had the main contact with, I found the Deputy Minister to be very attuned to the issues and to want to take action on those. That didn't always translate into action by the government, however. And I think there needed to be a stronger voice, probably, at cabinet level to make sure that issues affecting older people and indeed disabled people were better taken account of, and a greater focus placed on the need to protect older people living in care homes.
Thank you. In your statement, you raised concerns that blanket decisions were made about people in care homes. For example, blanket bans on access to visits or to healthcare. You say that decisions should have been made on an individual basis, considering the person's risks, needs and wishes. In your view, did care service users receive person-centred care based on individual assessments during the pandemic?
Well, from many thousands of older people living in care homes, and from what I know about the care homes I had contact with and worked with, then many of them would have been getting really good care provided by compassionate and skilled people who were doing their utmost under unbelievably difficult circumstances. It's impossible to say that everybody had that level of care. Indeed, that's not the case. I know that not everybody would have had that level of care, but it'd be wrong, I think, to say that no one had that level of care.
Can you make any recommendations as to how in future these sort of blanket decisions can be avoided and better individualised assessments implemented in a pandemic?
Well, we have quite a lot of the legislation in place for that. In Wales, the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, for example, is very person-centred. It's all about implementation. And having legislation is not enough on its own, and it's not enough if there's no accountability to it if it's not followed. So I think there needs to be a much greater focus, as I've said, on ensuring that the legal rights that older people have wherever they live are recognised and followed. And along with that, ensuring that there's sufficient resourcing so that people working in social care can follow the legislation and can work in the way that they want to work and have been trained to work, which is in a person-centred way.
So in terms of practical steps to ensure that those statutory duties are implemented, I think you mentioned earlier training is one, and then you've also just touched upon accountability and resources. Are those three things that can be put in place to ensure that those statutory duties are better effected? Yes,
I believe so.
Thank you. At paragraph 139, you state, in my opinion, the initial decision-making on visiting under public health guidance was based on the risks of COVID-19 infection, but did not take into account the harm to health and well-being for older people being isolated. I also felt it did not take adequate account of the human rights of older people. In what ways should the balance between indirect harms resulting from visiting restrictions and COVID infection control, on the other hand, have been better struck?
My sense was that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was hardly any consideration of the harms of people in care homes being isolated from their loved ones. That the entire focus, particularly from Public Health Wales, was about the infection risk rather than the risk caused by isolation, or as some people felt, feelings of abandonment from their family. So I think it's a case of due weight being given to those different aspects and a better understanding of the impact of isolation, of not being able to see loved ones, of people not being able to visit into care homes. And there's probably some more work that needs to be done to demonstrate that evidence about those harms, so that should there be a future pandemic, it's much, the evidence is already there to make those decisions more quickly and more robustly. So in
answering the question, why was so much weight given to COVID and so little weight given to indirect harms, is one answer that the data wasn't available. But are there other answers to that question?
I think it's about people not being aware of the impact. So data is one way to demonstrate that. Qualitative evidence is also, I think, very important in this context. And also, it was the case that some of the people making decisions about care homes had little understanding about care homes and how they operate and how people live in care homes, and that is definitely an area that needs to improve. It shouldn't be the case that people are making decisions about an area where they don't really understand it.
Thank you. The last area is about dementia. Can you outline the particular problems that people with dementia and also their carers had during the pandemic?
For many people living with dementia and their carers, the pandemic was unbelievably difficult. If I think about people living in their own homes, with the closure of respite facilities, daycare facilities, people not always wanting domiciliary care workers to come into their homes because they were frightened of the risk. It meant that many unpaid carers of people with dementia had to do a lot more. So the demands on them became much more challenging during the pandemic because their network of support had been taken away. So the stress on unpaid carers of people living with dementia in the community, and the difficulty for people living with dementia as well if they weren't getting the support they were getting before. In relation to people living with dementia in care homes, I think particularly sometimes it meant that it was more difficult for them to understand why they couldn't see their loved ones. And in my Care Home Voices report, and from the discussions I had with older people and families at the time, people expressed that to me. They said that their loved one, didn't understand why they couldn't see their family, felt abandoned by their family. And therefore, I think for people with dementia during the pandemic, it was a particularly difficult time. And we know also that some of what happened in the pandemic would have meant that their dementia may have advanced more as well because they weren't getting the support and the stimulation that they needed.
Do you consider that the government understood those difficulties that people with dementia faced?
I don't know. Again, I think the Welsh Government is, it's not one entity in that sense. There are certainly people that I work with at official level who understood and were passionate about helping people with dementia. So again, I think it's about whether those people with expertise were in the right positions in order to influence decisions and whether those decisions were ultimately taken by Welsh Government.
Similar question, do you consider that the Welsh Government made appropriate provision for people with dementia during the pandemic?
Again, it's difficult to me to assess that overall. What I would say is that the lack of support that people experience because of a number of things actually, so not just in terms of government action, but issues, for example, that support services were shut, people who normally would access help, particularly people living with dementia from organisations and charities, they couldn't carry out their work in the normal way. So that complete picture meant that it would be very difficult for people to maintain the level of care and support that they needed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Straw. That completes the questions we have for you, Ms. Herklot. I think it's probably the last time we're going to have to ask you to come along and give evidence. I'm very sorry to have to make you relive, obviously, what were difficult times for everybody. So thank you very much for all the help you've given to the inquiry.
Thank you.
Very well, I shall return at 25 past. Miss Paisley.
My lady, the next witness is Melanie Minty.
If you'd like to repeat after me. I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
shall
be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Ms. Minty, I'm sorry if you're the last witness of the day and we've kept you waiting.
Thank you, my lady.
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending the inquiry today and for providing your statement to this module dated the 13th of November 2024. By way of background, you have worked for Care Forum Wales since 2012, currently as a senior policy advisor, and prior to that as policy advisor supporting the former chief executive. Is that right?
That's right.
Care Forum Wales is the main representative organisation for care providers in Wales. It has 418 members across all regions of Wales. Approximately 85% of those are residential settings and the remainder are domiciliary care providers. You explain that your members include a variety of organisations, ranging from small family-run enterprises to larger corporate organisations and local government providers. and your members provide both private and publicly funded care for a wide range of individuals, including younger and older adults, those with physical and mental health needs, and those that require complex nursing. Is that all correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I move, please, to the role of Care Forum Wales during the pandemic? At paragraph 88 of your statement, you provide an overview of key groups attended by Care Forum Wales, which were led by the Welsh Government, and some of those meetings were also attended by the regulator, commissioners and Public Health Wales. Generally speaking, what was the role played by Care Forum Wales in those meetings?
Generally speaking, it was to feed back intelligence from the ground, as it were. So, in particular, we had a WhatsApp group for our members that we'd set up in early March, and they used that to share concerns and good practice and ideas for resolving things. So we were able to keep a sort of really sort of quite live eye on things that were going on, and then use that to feed back to policymakers to influence what was being done to support the sector.
And in your experience, do you think, firstly, that there was enough engagement with stakeholders, such as Care Forum Wales, by those different entities and groups that we've just discussed?
I think we were disappointed that it got off to a bit of a slow start. I think, you know, we were in the position in the early days of probably having to chase people up and say, don't forget about the sector. Have you got anything, policy that's specific to the sector that we need to know about? After late March, early April, things were much better, and you know, once everybody was pulling together, that engagement was excellent from that point onwards.
And so from your perspective, in the event of a future pandemic of a similar nature, including those stakeholders at the earliest opportunity is something you would endorse?
Absolutely.
And you've just briefly touched upon it, but can you give an overview of how open and effective the engagement was?
It was very, very open. You know, our chair was meeting weekly with the minister, and Mary Wimbrey, our chief executive, and myself were involved in a number of national meetings. You know, there were a lot of strategic meetings held weekly with all the stakeholders involved, and then there were a number of task and finish groups, working groups, looking at things like do not resuscitate decisions.
And reflecting then on some aspects of good practice, one example you raise is that Care Forum Wales was engaged in working groups looking, for example, at care home cleaning guidance.
Yes.
And it developed strong links with Public Health Wales that have continued beyond the pandemic. Are there any other particular instances of good practice?
We have been working with the former Older People's Commissioner on sort of visiting, not visiting, but sort of rights of tenure of older people and in care homes, and that's involved the families groups as well, just to sort of try and work out some of those rights and that we don't lose sight of them moving forward.
Another specific group I just have a question about, please, is the Social Care Fair Work Forum.
Oh, yes.
And at paragraph 101, you say the recognition of the value of social care workers led to the creation of the Social Care Fair Work Forum by the Welsh Government and the commitment to improving terms and conditions. Does that forum still meet?
Yes, it does. It's evolved into a social care fair work partnership, and it's actually doing quite a lot of the work that the UK government is now doing in terms of looking at the voice of unions in the sector, pay and progression, fair working conditions.
And so that's a positive that that's still
Oh,
ongoing.
absolutely, absolutely.
Can I then please move to some questions about guidance provided to the sector and ask for your comments? If we can have on screen INQ 30183761, please. And Mary Wimbury sent an email to Sir Frank Atherton on the 2nd of March, stating, following my email last week, asking if advice was specifically being provided to the care sector, I note that Public Health England has issued such advice. And she went on to say, in the absence of other information, we assume Public Health Wales advice would be as per Public Health England advice. And then Sir Frank's office responded on the 10th of March to say there is specific Welsh guidance similar to that issued by Public Health England. Now, guidance had been issued on the 9th of March. Do you think that the initial guidance produced by both Public Health Wales and the Welsh Government was done in a timely manner?
It could have been done earlier, I believe. It's something that, you know, maybe it's the benefit of hindsight, but I think providers were very risk averse right from the beginning, had started to worry about it quite some time before messages began to come out through the governments about the potential scale of the pandemic. And you know, before this advice had come out, we'd already got a lot of providers who'd felt they were forced into the position of refusing to take admissions from hospital because they weren't satisfied with the guidance and the potential risks to their residents because of the very nature of an elderly population with existing comorbidities.
And we'll come on to touch upon the specific guidance. But generally speaking, would your view be that the earlier guidance can be produced for the sector, the better?
Absolutely, absolutely. Especially and it needs to be tailor-made because so often, as in this instance, a lot of the initial guidance that came out was more geared towards health. And it's really important that people understand in social care that you've got a different workforce and that you're talking about people's homes, not institutions.
And likewise, it should also be tailor-made for the domiciliary care sector.
Yes,
as opposed
absolutely,
to residential.
absolutely, yes, because, you know, we did find discrepancies in things like PPE guidance, which is very different for someone who's within a care home and someone who's accompanying someone outside.
Staying with this document, please, on page 2, Mary Wimbury had said on the 2nd of March, we would be happy to facilitate faster discharge from hospital and the use of care home beds to free up space in our hospitals should that become necessary. Can you help us with what role Care Forum Wales would have to play generally?
I think probably it would be encouraging members to take people from hospitals, subject to us all being satisfied that the procedures for that were safe.
Thank you. That document can come down. Staying with the topic of discharge, please. At paragraph 24 of your statement, you say, before COVID-19, the sector didn't have enough beds to help free up hospital beds, especially suitable dementia care places. The situation got dramatically worse in the first few months of COVID-19, with hospitals trying to free up beds and social care workers trying to find suitable placements for people who were going to be stuck shielding in their own homes. And at paragraph 35 of your statement, you say, at the end of March 2020, we issued a press release about care homes being treated as collateral damage as a result of the discharge policy. During this time, many members were resisting pressure to take new admissions directly from hospital unless they had been tested, often insisting on 2 tests to allow for false results. So bearing in mind then the email that was sent by Mary Wimbury and the comments in your statement, was it the view of Care Forum Wales that in principle there was nothing wrong with this decision, it was just poorly executed?
The decision to
discharge.
No, I think we thought it was faulty. Without knowing more and understanding more about COVID itself. But we were, our members were broadly concerned about the behaviour sometimes of visiting families, but also the lack of PPE, the lack of testing for anybody other than symptomatic residents. So we could have got all that straight. I think it would have assisted in those decisions.
Yes, because returning back to what Mary Wimbury had said, that Care for Wales would be happy, it seems as though it's not against it. In principle, it's just how it was operating that was the problem.
Yes, I think that's probably a fair description.
You explained generally that there were difficulties when guidance was issued on a Friday. What sorts of difficulties arose if it was issued on a Friday?
The guidance would appear, or the statement would be made on a Friday, but it wouldn't necessarily get through to everybody at once. Very often care homes are operating on fairly low levels of staffing over the weekend, but of course people at Public Health Wales, local authorities, all those people who are also decision makers may not be working at all at weekends, so people would come in and not know that things had changed, and they'd be telling care homes that they were working on the wrong guidance, so it did cause a lot of toing and froing.
And practically speaking, given in such a fast-moving scenario where there is need to get guidance out as urgently as possible, where does the balance lie between, for example, issuing on a Friday and getting it out as quickly as possible, if you have any views?
It's not an easy solution. I would admit I think it would have been difficult for people to coordinate, but there must be something we can learn, I think, about communicating throughout the piece, as it were, so that everybody has the same understanding of the information.
In fact, one of the things you raise in your statement is that there were difficulties with version control. So sometimes it was not clear what had been updated. Would that perhaps be one way of rectifying the difficulties?
Absolutely, because unless you had, unless you had the two versions side by side, you wouldn't know what had changed. And when people were working in such difficult circumstances, the last thing they needed was to be spending a long time trying to work out what they should be doing. And I did raise it a few times with Welsh Government, but the impression I had was that it was actually a problem with the Welsh Government Central Communications team, who didn't like to have sort of scrappy track changes documents online, but I think things have improved. I noticed the other day that Public Health Wales had put something on their website and CIW with track changes. So
I think the inquiry has seen some examples of updates being given on page 1, for example, so that it can be quite quickly seen. So there is an importance in being able to rapidly identify. Yes. Again, dealing with the rapidly changing guidance, are you aware if there was somewhere, a forum that Care for Wales could go to identify all relevant guidance in place at any given time?
Eventually it came to be held on Public Health Wales's website.
And do you think that was something that was helpful, so somebody could go in and go to one place?
Yes, definitely.
Now, a SWOT analysis was undertaken in July 2020, and if we can please have on screen INQ 301837663. Firstly at page 1, and this gives an overview of this analysis. And it says in June 2020, a group of social care and support providers were brought together by Care for Wales and others to discuss and reflect on the shared response to the initial outbreak of COVID-19 in the first half of 2020. The purpose of this exercise was to provide a space for shared reflection to identify what worked well and less well during this initial period to inform future action. Does that give a general overview of this analysis? Yes. Can we then please have page 5? And one of the issues identified was that some local authorities were too keen to get on top of it too quickly. Some wrote their own guidance, and this was rapidly out of date, particularly around PPE. There needed to be a balance across local authorities in how quickly they responded. At the same time, some local authorities waited for instruction and specific policy guidance and expected the system to take care of supporting providers rather than taking action themselves. And so it's whether you have any views on where the balance may lie in respect of local authority action.
I think it's probably a situation that's worse in Wales because it's a population the size of Manchester, but we've got 22 local authorities. So very quickly you'll find that a provider has got residents who are commissioned from about 3 different local authorities. So that need for a sort of consistent and early approach is, I think, particularly relevant for our members.
Do you think perhaps greater stakeholder engagement or early stakeholder engagement with, for example, Care4 Wales might be a way to feed those?
Yes, I think so, and I think it's probably a little bit like the engagement that we were talking about earlier, and it is one of the issues as well with relying too much on local authorities to do things sometimes.
That document can come down, please. And in fact, we're going to be staying with the topic of local authorities, but in respect of funding provisions over the pandemic. And at paragraph 56, you say, members welcomed the extent of the hardship funding provided by the Welsh Government during COVID to support providers with the additional costs of COVID, without which many would not have been able to operate. But in a similar vein, you explain significant problems were experienced with regard to the distribution of the funding through the local authorities, which resulted in 22 different ways of working. Do you have any ideas or thoughts as to how that could be avoided?
I think a greater degree of direction from government about how local authorities should distribute the funding, because they all came up with their own methodologies, be it fixed payments, percentages. They all had different interpretations of whether it was to include private funders or self-funders that they were covering. So, I mean, the funding itself was fabulous. I don't think there was anything similar in England. Undoubtedly, it's saved many closures. But I think there's a lingering issue in Wales in that we have these 22 local authorities, and Welsh Government is under great pressure from them not to erode any local democracy by taking any central decisions.
So finding the balance then in the clarity, and perhaps if those decisions had been explained to providers, might that have assisted?
It might have done, but I think really it was. There didn't need to be as many different ways of doing it. There really didn't.
We don't need it back on screen, but this is something else that was discussed in the SWOT analysis, and it was noted that funding has been slow to reach the front line. Was that also in relationship to the hardship funding, or was that in respect of something else?
I think that was in respect of the hardship funding.
And do you have any view on how it could get to the front line quicker beyond what we've just discussed?
It was really about what we just discussed, about having different ways, which meant some people were some local authorities were very bureaucratic about it and were asking for receipts and so on.
Finally, on funding, please, in respect of the financial support given to individuals and specifically sick pay issues, do you feel that support was given quickly enough to individuals in Wales?
I think Welsh Government sorted it out fairly quickly. There were a few lingering concerns about some of the employment law aspects, but by and large, I think it came fairly quickly.
Because the inquiry has heard evidence that, in fact, it was much later in Wales with regards to sick pay than it was in the rest of the UK.
Yes, I think it probably was, actually.
And what sorts of difficulties would that cause on the ground?
Well, I suppose that the main one is if someone is not going to be paid sick leave, they're going to carry on working and potentially bring the infection into the care home.
Going to move topic again, please, to concerns about PPE. And you've explained that staff were frightened to work because of the lack of PPE. Do you have any direct examples of what you were hearing about the situation in care homes?
We had a lot of nervousness about the fact that care homes were being told that they only needed PPE when people were symptomatic, whereas it was people in hospitals were being treated with it routinely, people were being tested routinely, whether they were symptomatic or not. And I think what probably pushed people over the edge slightly is that the number of professionals who visited care homes who were wearing full PPE. It felt as if they were protecting themselves and not the care homes.
You actually touch upon this in your statement, and you say there was a general perception that stocks were being ring-fenced for hospitals. What steps would have helped to make care sector staff feel as though they were on a parity with healthcare?
Well, I think they established a really good method of administering and circulating PPE further on, which would have solved the problem if it had been there at the start. But we didn't have the volumes that we needed, and I think it partly goes back to social care always being the sort of junior member of the partnership, shall we say, and protecting health.
In your statement, you talk about the NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership, which was established. And so in your evidence, it would have been helpful if that had been established at the outset.
Yes, because at the beginning it was providing PPE for health, but they had the expertise to do it more widely.
And similarly to previous points that we've discussed, you say that it was distributed to local authorities in proportion to the size of the local authority rather than the size of the care home within the authority, which led to delays in providing adequate stock. And you give an example to one of the largest care homes in Wales because that was in fact situated in the smallest local authority. And the inquiry heard evidence yesterday from Dr. Llewellyn, who said he thinks that this may have been as a result of issues with communication. So again, does that just reiterate the importance of discussions with the sector as early as possible?
Yes, and I think as time went on, they got better at actually working out the volumes that people would need and how to do it on a better sort of formula.
Mr. Hancock said in his evidence to the inquiry that everybody's got a cupboard and so it's totally reasonable to require a degree of PPE, say a month's supply, you can pull any time period out of a hat, but a month would seem reasonable. Is that something you endorse, and is that something practical for care homes?
It isn't really. I think somewhere in the statement I said that we had members who would keep 2 to 3 weeks as standard. A lot of care homes in Wales in particular are sort of quite old structures. They're probably converted residential homes and so on. So storage space is at an absolute premium, and it wouldn't be possible for people to keep large amounts.
And so would your evidence then be, given the nature of the care sector in Wales, having a central distribution system that works effectively?
It certainly did, yes. Solution? Yes, it worked well once it was up and running.
Can I now ask you a couple of short questions about staff shortages, please? And at paragraph 30, you explain that care homes were trying to avoid use of agency staff due to risk of infection. However, some reached the point of desperation where they were forced to ask staff with COVID to look after residents with COVID. How wide-scale an issue was that?
I don't think the use of staff with COVID was a regular occurrence. I think it only happened in a sort of handful of homes where they were so desperate that they would have to close the doors so they didn't do something about it. But certainly the shortages were widespread. And
to your knowledge, in an example where somebody with COVID was asked to work through, of course, desperation, how did that operate in the homes? So, for example, were the residents or the families of the residents told about it?
To be honest, I can't answer that one. I don't know.
Do you have any views on how reaching that point of desperation could be avoided in the future?
I think if we'd had proper protection for care workers from the beginning in terms of PPE, and the regular testing, if it hadn't just been symptomatic, I think that would have resolved a lot of issues from the beginning. But a lot of it is also down to the sort of financial vulnerable situation that we were in before COVID even.
And in fact, if we can move on to discuss testing in more detail, please. Can we have the SWOT analysis back on the screen? INQ 301837663 at page 7. And just to remind ourselves, this was around July 2020 that this was undertaken. And it says under testing policy and implementation, testing is generally still a mess and took a long time to get even where we are now. Initially getting testing for those who were asymptomatic or even those who were symptomatic in a care home which already had an outbreak was challenging. Then goes on to say, now there is regular testing, but results are still slow to turn around, and there is no routine testing of frontline care and healthcare workers outside care homes. And 2 questions arise from this, please. Firstly, can you assist in the summer of 2020, so this is July, how slow were the tests being taken to turn around for providers at this point, and what issues did that cause?
That's quite a long time to remember, but I think it was probably about a week to get the results back in most cases. And we did have incidences where, for instance, someone had been at work before they were even sent a notice that they needed a retest, and they'd been working almost the week before they were told that they shouldn't be there. So yeah, that sort of thing was very regular.
And the second question, please, talking about there is no regular testing or routine testing of frontline care and health workers outside care homes. Is that in respect of domiciliary care? And the inquiry understands regular testing of domiciliary care in Wales was not rolled out until the 14th of December 2020. Do you consider that was too late?
I think so. I mean, domiciliary care workers are by nature going around the community. They're going into different people's homes, and these people are very vulnerable, so it makes no sense to have left it to that position.
To the best of your knowledge, do you know if Care Forum Wales, having seen this analysis, raised this directly with the Welsh Government at this time?
I'm fairly sure that we would have done at the meetings. Along with all the other things that we've been raising, we would have been raising it for domiciliary care workers too.
And just the final line of this, the Holy Grail would be a point of care test with a fast result readily available. Now, the inquiry understands lateral flow devices were a point of care test. Did that resolve any of the problems, or did problems still persist?
Lateral flow certainly speeded things up dramatically.
Staying with testing, please, and can we have your statement on screen? INQ 305172219, paragraph 68, which is on page 24. You explain in October 2020, we carried out an informal survey with our members about the various issues being reported over the previous fortnight. 75 providers across Wales responded, 45.7% saying they had experienced problems entering data on the Lighthouse lab system, 22.5% reporting a collection, meaning the test had gone to waste, 28.2% were still waiting at least one further result after 7 days, 16 had waited 6 to 7 days, and perhaps I don't need to read the rest of it out, but we see a general picture that there were problems with testing. Now, point of care testing with quick results may not be something that's immediately ready in the event of a new disease. Are there any practical things that you could help us with that may resolve these issues? For example, were there administrative tasks associated with testing that caused a delay, or do you have any ideas on how issues like this could be avoided?
I think a lot of it was about the system. Sometimes providers ended up having to put things in manually. So I think it would be good to have that sort of database kept up to date in the background so that it could be rolled out again if necessary.
And so looking at the databases and the processes in non-pandemic times to ensure that they're ready to
and
be
fit
off
for
the ground.
purpose, yeah.
Thank you. That document can come down. I have two substantive topics before I ask about your final reflections, please. The first of those is infection prevention and control. The inquiry has heard evidence, and you mention in your statement at paragraph 81, that some providers took innovative approaches to try to isolate residents. You give an example of a care home dividing itself into wings or sections to isolate people with symptoms or those that had had positive tests. However, as you acknowledged, this was not always possible, depending on the size and layout of the building. And the inquiry's heard evidence about Wales in particular having a number of smaller care homes. Mr. Hancock said in his evidence to the inquiry, his big recommendation now was that every care home needs to have isolation facilities. Is that something, in fact, in Wales that is realistic and achievable?
I would suspect it wouldn't be achievable. I suspect it would be very difficult without an immense amount of investment. Even if it was structurally possible, because some of these buildings are very old indeed.
And the inquiry again has heard evidence about the use of designated settings and step up and step down. Would that be a solution for those care homes that are perhaps too small to have designated isolation facilities?
Yes, potentially.
At paragraph 82, you discuss further approaches that care homes took themselves. And another example you give is that many care homes stopped using agency workers and introduced new rotas to reduce the frequency in which staff had to change over. In many cases, staff moved into the care home itself to reduce the risk of transmission between work and family. Do you think that these types of measures had a place in centrally issued guidance or the public health body advice, so perhaps as options that care homes could consider?
Yes, definitely. It did feel as if providers were coming up with best practice off their own bat, and we were sharing it through our networks, but there would be people who wouldn't have access to that.
And I understand there was a WhatsApp group facilitated, for example. Was there a way that these innovative approaches were fed back into central government that you were aware of?
We would have used the weekly meetings with the COVID strategy groups and any other sort of ad hoc groups. We were in almost constant contact with different organisations, so we would have passed them on when they were relevant.
And so your view would be that it could perhaps provide a list of things that a care home that was struggling as innovative examples and ways to help them?
Yes.
If I can then please move to visiting. At paragraph 51 of your statement, you explain, we were involved in detailed discussions on the guidance to opening up care home visiting. This was undertaken with the best of intentions, but often with little recognition that our members were dealing with visitors who may refuse to abide by infection prevention and control measures and did not always react predictably. Now, of course, the lack of visiting was very difficult for residents and their families, but were your members perhaps raising the other side of the coin, which is the risks that come with visiting in a pandemic scenario?
At the start, definitely. A lot of them actually closed down deliberately because of the pressure to take people from hospital when they weren't being tested and so on. And we did have some very early conversations. I think it was back in February, one of our members had a visitor who came from the area in China where it all started. He'd just come back and he refused to wash his hands or wear a mask to visit the resident. So that caused immediate concerns, obviously.
I think you made an important caveat there, which was that this was at the start.
At the very start, yes.
And so, for example, if there had been better PPE, better testing, for example, the that might not have been the view of providers?
No, I think if we'd had guidance as well, because it was left very much to care homes to make their own decisions, which of course put them in the middle between health and the need for people to be able to see their families and so on.
And so where does the balance lie between keeping people safe and facilitating those visits? Is it the initiatives that were set up, so greater use of essential caregiver status, outdoor visiting, and ensuring that there is guidance, as you've discussed?
I think so, but I think also that the pandemic went on for so long that those measures weren't enough of themselves, because people were beginning to deteriorate when they weren't able to access their families. So they could only be short-term measures. But I think the Welsh Government came up with a raft of some good visiting policies, but also support for things like the visiting pods were really helpful.
And do you think that there is an importance to risk assess each individual visit or each individual residence regarding what they might need?
I think it would be really difficult to do it on an individual basis, because it's the footfall into the home that is the problem. And, it was very difficult sometimes, because you've got some families who obviously desperately wanted to see the resident, but you'd have other families who would say, don't let anybody in. I don't want it spreading to my family, so it's a very difficult balance.
One thing you mentioned was that because this went on for so long that it was a problem. So in your view, was there a point at which the blanket banning simply became disproportionate?
I think so. I think there came a stage where providers were saying that we need to let people back in now. And then I suppose that's when that risk assessment could take place, when the pandemic was easing somewhat.
And a similar point is made in your statement about visits from medical professionals and the difficulties that were caused. Again, this is on both sides of the coin. You say, for example, one care home worker in Wales told the inquiry that they often felt unsupported in their attempts to keep people safe. One member contacted us saying, in this specific home, we have a client with COPD and asthma, another with stage 2 respiratory failure. And as such, we've contacted the NHS mental health team and asked to postpone the planned meetings or to do these via FaceTime. And instead of an understanding approach, my assistant manager was told that it was going ahead and that they were coming to the home regardless in no uncertain terms. This means there will be 4 social workers or mental health coordinators from different offices in Wales coming into an environment which we consider high risk. My staff feel they can manage the coronavirus situation and protect the high-risk people we care for, but I cannot express how unhelpful this approach from the local authority and NHS is. And then on the other side, the inquiry's heard evidence from Every Story Matters, and an example of a care home worker who told the inquiry you would have doctors completely refusing to come in, or if they did, you have to wait absolute hours for them to come in and certify the deaths. So a similar question, where does the balance lie? Because, of course, both are attempts to keep people safe.
Yeah, I think the balance is that people who are visiting for genuine health needs, clinical needs, should be able to visit, and certainly should make the option. I suppose that's the issue, is that in many cases care homes and residents weren't given the option. They were just told the district nurse isn't coming, or the GP isn't coming, and I think some of the issues expressed about the number of local authority people coming in was probably more where it was to do with a planning or assessment of needs type thing, which is quite a sort of bureaucratic thing rather than actually something that would help someone with their actual health needs.
Final question, please, on visiting medical professionals, particularly in regards to lack of access to clinical support at the end of life. Now, of course, that would be distressing for staff. It may cause residents to experience a lack of dignity, and of course the impact on families that couldn't be there. In respect of end-of-life care, do you have any thoughts on how it could be ensured that these traumatic events don't happen in the future?
I think it improved. I think probably the most horrendous examples were from early on in COVID, and it's about that lack of messaging. We had, I think I used an example of a care home in North Wales where they couldn't get the GP to come out. The staff were having to take observations, so they weren't trained because there was no one else there to do it. The person was in horrendous pain. And they had to,
Sorry to interject. Would training, for example, in those circumstances have been something that may have helped?
I think, yeah, that it would help if we prepared social care workers to step up further. And I suppose there are elements of that happening. But I think, it was that nobody knew what was going on, so nobody would go in and offer help.
So advanced planning?
Advanced planning again.
In terms of training, who would deliver training in those scenarios, or who should deliver training?
I think there are some good modules probably from health that could quite easily be rolled out. I mean, certainly we're doing more and more with medicines administration and so on for care workers and domiciliary care workers. So
Care Forum Wales itself delivers some...
We don't deliver training, no, but we do work closely with PHW and Social Care Wales who sort of sign off on most of the training.
Other than, for example, clinical support at the end of life, what other areas of training do you think would have assisted those working in the sector?
Possibly some level of palliative care training, because a lot of people who died were in residential homes where you wouldn't expect someone necessarily to die in the care home unless they were supported and had that wraparound service. And I think the counselling for care workers themselves probably came later than it should have done.
Just two final short reflections, if I can, please. Do you have any thoughts on the impact of staff movement within the sector and any views on if that can be addressed, and if so, how?
Do you mean around the sector or?
Yes, so the inquiry has heard evidence about the risk of staff movement in terms of transmission. Is that something that practically could be dealt with, or is that just the nature of the sector?
I think one of the issues is the heavy reliance on agency staff, and I think most people cut down on agency staff by using, by staff volunteering to move into the home by changing the way the rosters worked. So there was that element of it, but I don't think we're at all prepared for anything similar to happen in the future when we've got such a reliance on the overseas workforce, and that's an issue in itself.
So perhaps when we explored earlier about central guidance, having options and ideas, might that be one way to
Yes,
help?
yes.
And then just finally, please, beyond any matters we've already covered, are there any specific recommendations you would urge the inquiry to consider in particular?
I don't think there are. I think we've probably covered them all. Thank you.
Very grateful. My lady, I have no further questions. I believe there are some core participant questions.
There are, and I think Mr. Stanton, you should be directly across the hearing room.
Thank you, Melanie. Good afternoon, Ms. Minty.
Afternoon.
I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 Brief Families for Justice Cymru. I have a question in relation to paragraph 66 of your statement, which I'd be grateful if it could be brought up on screen, please. And that's at INQ 000517219_0023. Hopefully you see that on your screen, Ms. Minty.
Yes.
Halfway through the paragraph, there is a sentence that begins, the early focus of care home testing. Do you have that?
Yes.
And it continues, was on larger homes with symptomatic residents on the basis of evidence, in inverted commas, that COVID spread more readily in larger environments. The use of inverted commas applied to the word evidence would tend to suggest that you have doubts about the focus on larger care homes. And I wonder if that is correct. Please, could you explain them?
Yes, I think the view of most providers would be that there was very little evidence of anything during COVID because advice and medical opinion changed constantly. And we were aware of outbreaks in small homes as well. So I think, I suppose there's a likelihood of it spreading more in a contained situation just because it was bigger. But then again, some of the bigger homes would also have had more facilities to isolate people and keep the residents safe, and smaller homes would have found that more difficult. So I don't think we ever believed that there was a strong enough basis to deny that sort of same level of testing and so on in smaller homes. It felt as if we were sort of leaving them to it.
Thank you. Next question relates to a Care Forum Wales submission to the Health, Social Care and Sports Committee on the 7th of May. This is at INQ 000183754, but we don't need to bring it up on screen. Within that submission, it is stated on behalf of Care Forum Wales that anecdotally, most outbreaks in care homes can be traced back to asymptomatic residents and staff. And my question is, are you able to indicate when Care Forum Wales was first aware of the risk of asymptomatic transmission on such a significant level?
I can't honestly say how early it was. It was very much anecdotal information, but it was something that people on our WhatsApp group were saying that, you know, they hadn't had any signs of anything. So how else was it getting in if people weren't already carrying it when they were asymptomatic?
Thank you. And final question, back to your statement, please. And if we could have up on screen, please, paragraph 58 of your statement, which is at INQ 000517219_0021. Here, you address the issue of DNACPRs, and it's dealt with fairly shortly at paragraph 58, and you indicate that this does not appear to have been a particular issue in Wales. You may have heard the evidence given earlier today by Helena Herklotz, which indicated a slightly different position. She obviously considered it to be an issue, and it is a very big issue for my clients. I wonder whether there's any explanation for the statement you make to the effect that you didn't think it was a big issue?
I think it's not something that was brought up particularly by members on our WhatsApp group. I didn't mean it to sound dismissive, because obviously it's a massive situation when it does occur. The only one I was aware of was a GP surgery in Bridgend, but it wasn't flagged up by most of our other members. And Welsh Government fairly quickly set up a task and finish group looking at them, which I was involved in. And I think it was clear that we need to do much better about that in future. That's one of the way that we can definitely plan. And I think one of the problems that we found was that it should be a function of a doctor primarily to discuss this with someone before it becomes necessary. But a lot of the training hasn't been done, so we were aware that in pockets that people were being asked to carry out the conversations, but I wasn't aware of it being a blanket. You need to get all your residents to sign these. Certainly, as I said in my evidence, our members would have been horrified by that.
Yes. Well, thank you, Ms Minty. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Straw, who'll be the other side of the room again, but slightly further down. Back.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I represent John's Campaign, the Patients Association and Care Rights UK. In your witness statement in paragraph 103, you say that the lack of protection given to people in care was symptomatic of prejudice, in particular towards older people. Do you know where that prejudice towards older people in care came from?
I think it's a societal thing. I think it's just the way, as a society, we treat older people as if they don't seem to matter once they hit a certain age, and they're not considered to add particular value. I think in Wales we're very lucky that we've got the Older People's Commissioner, and a very sort of firm rights base. But even then, I think it's easy to overlook the older generation, and my perception sometimes is that if you're in a care home, it's considered that that's what you need, and nothing more. And there's little investment in all the things that make it fulfilling.
Thank you. A different issue. In your statement and earlier on today as well, you noted that there was guidance which wasn't appropriate to domiciliary care, to put it broadly. Can you explain what adverse consequences this had, so the inappropriate guidance, for people in domiciliary care?
I think a lot of it was sort of practical around the donning and doffing of uniform. If you're doing that in someone's house, where do you go to do it, or are you supposed to do it in the car when you get there? So that it was confusion, which probably ate into the time when someone was supposed to be actually there giving support direct to the individual. But also when PPE was needed to be worn out in the community, and when it wouldn't necessarily be required by other people, it just made the whole experience for the individual more unpleasant than it needed to be.
And that's on PPE. Were there other areas of guidance which was inappropriate, unclear, and that caused problems for people in care?
I think perhaps there wasn't a great deal of specific guidance for domiciliary care generally. I think probably the worst issue was the lack of testing, and the generally forgetting that when you're a domiciliary care worker, you're in someone else's home, and it's therefore very difficult to enforce certain things that you would in a care home, and quite rightly so, because it's the individual's right to have the care provided the way they need it.
Thank you. At paragraphs 47 and 49, you explained that care homes had certain difficulties in accessing medical services and the necessary clinical support. Again, this is an issue you touched upon earlier. Firstly, what were the consequences for people needing care of this?
Well, I think we've already touched on probably the worst elements, which was the lack of a sort of professional palliative care in care homes, which weren't equipped to deal with that sort of end-of-life situation. We know that some GPs refused to visit. It was difficult to access GP surgeries. There should probably have been attempts to set up direct lines to make it easier for people to get through. Generally speaking, I think there was support in a lot of areas, but in some other areas it was things like the district nurses not being allowed to visit, so they couldn't help residential homes where there's no nurse on duty, with things like insulin. So the routine medication that a care home isn't allowed to do, they were suddenly having to work out how to do so. It comes back to that training thing that we were talking about earlier.
Yes, my next question was going to be, can you help what caused the difficulties? You've mentioned training there. Are there other factors that cause those difficulties?
A lot of it's down to the regulations. There are certain things in a residential home that care workers can't do because there's not a nurse to supervise or to delegate duties. In a residential home, things like medications administration is delegated by a GP. So, of course, when the GP isn't visiting, that's an added complication.
And just going back a little bit further, so that's what's the immediate cause of the difficulties within the care homes. But do you know what was the cause of the difficulties of medical care coming into the care homes?
I think it was perceived, rightly or wrongly, I think, as a fear of actually catching it from the care home, possibly also a concern about spreading it. And it wasn't all bad because it did come up with some fairly good ways of doing virtual examinations where that was appropriate, but some of those were probably also where it wasn't appropriate and where a physical presence would have been a better solution for the person.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Straw. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Minty. That completes all the questions that we have for you. Thank you very much for your help with the inquiry and being with us today. I don't know if you're going back to Wales. Are you still living in Wales?
Yes.
Safe journey back whenever you go back.
Thank you.
Very well. That completes the evidence I shall hear today. I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.